So, can everybody hear me? I'm Michaela. I am a student in my last year at Eastern Michigan University. I am double majoring in biochemistry and women's studies. It's been a really fun but weird combination the entire way. I got into this work really because when I was in high school, I took this African American studies class, and I was like, why aren't we learning about any Black women? This is not fair. Black men do stuff, but they don't do everything. And so I started looking at Black women's work, and then I kind of discovered feminism, and then I started thinking more about sexual assault, and I was really hooked. It was really interesting. So when I got to college, I joined My Voice, which is the youth advisory board for MOASH, and I've been working with them for the past almost 3 years. My expertise in this area is more from a research standpoint. I am a sexual assault and domestic violence educator. I have been a sexual assault and domestic violence advocate to clients in Metro Detroit. And that work really is not for me. So I decided that I want to become a doctor, and I'm applying to medical school right now. And I wanted to be on this panel to help educate more people. I think this work is really important, and I would like to continue it more from an educational perspective rather than working one-on-one with survivors.
Awesome. Thanks, Michaela, for being on. And next, we're going to have Tajmika. Go ahead and do your intro. Thanks for coming on.
So first of all, my dog was completely quiet until you said it was my turn and someone came into my office. So I'd like to apologize in advance if you hear her barking. She's just saying hello. My name is Tajmika Torak. I'm the executive director of the Firecracker Foundation. We provide mental health therapy, trauma-sensitive yoga, and pediatric medical advocacy services to children who experience sexual violence and their families in the Tri-County area. We're 4 years old as an organization, and consent is a very important thing that we teach and that we practice as we offer healing services to families. And so we talk a lot about consent during our trauma-sensitive yoga and really encourage our teens and our children to own their no and to use it as much as feels appropriate for them on any given day. And we talk a lot about consent in all of the different ways that we work with families. So with parents, teaching them how to honor and respect the consent of their own kids, teaching everyone to have conversations about consent that can help them learn how to practice it as they get older. And so that's kind of what the lens is that I'm looking through for my participation, is how we teach consent. And how do we respect consent once that respect has been broken and it's been ignored? How do we reaffirm that consent can be given and taken away at any point, and that adults and others in relationship with you will honor that? So glad to be here.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's so important just from such a young age. Teaching about consent is huge. I think we can all agree. So we are going to go ahead and jump into questions. So again, for our attendees, we should have the Q&A popping up. So if you have a question, you can go ahead and submit it that way. And again, you can submit anonymously or with your name. But to go ahead and jump us off, want to first hear, for all of our panelists, what is rape culture? What is consent culture? And from either your experience, personally or with your work, can you give an example of consent or rape culture, or both?
I guess I can speak on rape culture. So I work at Eastern's Women's Resource Center, and my job really is to do more education on women's health, but there's lots of intersections of health, obviously. So rape culture is the fact that we still ask women what were you wearing while a sexual assault occurred? I could be butt ass naked and it still would be rape. We still ask questions like that. Just the way that we approach a lot of situations is rape culture. So like this, I remember my freshman year of college, like this really weird guy came to my door and was like asking for like the names of the women that like were living in my dorm with me and how long they had been going to our school. And when the police showed up, they just asked us all these stupid questions like, why did you answer the door? And we're like, we answered the door because someone knocked. Like, we answered the door because that's what you do when someone knocks at your door, the way that's approached. And also just like the fact that a lot of the times police officers like don't believe people. I was having an interaction with an officer on campus again, and he was saying that like, because more information was coming back to the survivor after a longer period of time because she hadn't mentioned that prior. That was a clue that she was like lying. And I'm like, so I had a conversation with his boss and I haven't seen him since. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Others on rape culture, consent culture?
Yeah, so I can go ahead. This is Rachel, if that's okay. So I can do something firsthand. As I said, I am a rape survivor, and I honestly did not report the assault when it happened because, quite frankly, I told somebody in my family very close to me what had happened, and the response to that was, well, why did you invite him over to your house if you did not want to have sex with him? And I felt like if somebody that I'm close with asked me that question, that's what the cops are going to ask me as well. And like, I was absolutely terrified of going there, being made a fool of, and then like if I tried to press charges, having to see him again, having to relive that. And I think that like, it's always crazy to me that even though I know I did nothing wrong, I still, like, when I talk about it, my first initial thing is to say, and I wasn't drinking, because I know somebody is going to ask that, like, were you drinking? Were you drunk? And, like, so initially I always, like, preface the story, I wasn't drinking at all, even though, like, I'm actually kind of participating in rape culture in a way, because it doesn't matter if I was drinking. It doesn't matter if I was drunk. But, like, we live in a world where victims are blamed and victims are questioned constantly. And so it's just kind of a knee-jerk reaction when something like that happens, and it shouldn't be.
Yeah, definitely. I think a huge part of rape culture is definitely this, like, victim blaming culture that is, leads to a lot of internalized victim blaming too.
This is Tashmika. Oh, sorry, Alexandra. I was just going to say, just to lift up what Rachel said, it is interesting that we do answer those unasked questions. Anytime that I'm writing about my own abuse that I experienced, or even when I'm talking about the abuse that happened to other people, whether they're in my family or I'm connected to them for other reasons, I still always want to say, I catch myself wanting to say like, oh, but they got in the car because of this. And, you know, they really wouldn't have gone except this thing happened, and really trying to censor myself from participating in rape culture, because I do recognize it and I hear it. And it's because we're so defensive, because we expect that someone is going to ask us those things. We want to like hurry up and get that painful part out of the way. You know, let me just go ahead and make these excuses so that you'll understand that my assault was legitimate. And so that's really sad. So, and then as far as thinking through like what a consent culture looks like, it's the opposite, right? Like it's recognizing that no person can take a person's bodily autonomy, like that our bodies are our own, and that regardless of when we give or take away consent, that needs to be respected. And so there aren't questions about what we were wearing or where we were going or why we were doing those things. There's questions about the harm doer, like how did this perpetrator become this person that feels that it's appropriate to sexually assault a human being? Like, those are the questions that we would be asking. And then on the flip side, on the other side of that, when we're talking about healing, we're really expressing to people that they have the right to say yes and no. And then in a community, even for simple things, when people say no, we're respecting that, and we're not joking about what it means to say no, and we're not making that a light thing. We're actually taking that very seriously, because we recognize that there's a thin line between actually acknowledging someone's consent and these rape jokes, right? Rape culture. And if we can say that that's not funny, and if we can live in community with one another, where we take our bodily autonomy very seriously and we practice that together, that is what consent culture looks like. At least one piece, right? Because it's a lot more than that.
Totally. Thank you. Alex, did you have something you wanted to add too?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what everyone has shared. And then I also think that there's this level of, when I think of rape culture, the first word that comes to my mind is assumptions. And I think that word can mean a lot of different things, but it's this basic assumption that someone has right to access to another's body, or assumption that we know better, or etc. And so when I think about this from the perspective of like the BDSM and kink community, which BDSM stands for bondage, dominance. Oh my God, I know this one. Bondage, discipline, dominance, submission, sadomasochism. Sorry, my brain is a bit fuzzy because of cold medicine. And so when we think about that, I think it's really easy to compare to say that BDSM or kink is inherently abusive, and that it is an example of rape culture, because we have assumptions about what it is. And I think I've seen instances of rape culture in the BDSM community, but I've also seen a lot of instances of consent culture, because the idea, one of the giant, huge, big rules in the BDSM community is you don't do something without talking to someone first, and without getting their permission, and without having a conversation. And you can't assume what somebody will like, or what you can do with someone, or anything. And so I think an example of consent culture really comes down to communication, and openness and honesty. And I think communication is the opposite of assumptions, even if it's uncomfortable. So.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think, everybody has like really touched on some great points, and really like a huge thing, like that consent culture isn't just this like bare minimum, people aren't getting sexually assaulted and raped. Like that's a very, very low bar, but rather people are having like healthy, positive, like open interactions where like, all sex that is happening is like really wanted and like not pressured or coerced in any way. So thank you all for sharing that. And for our next question, I know this is kind of like a big question, but maybe in like one small way, how can we move from a rape culture to consent culture? Obviously, if we could solve rape culture, we would hopefully like know how, but like in your experience, like what's one thing that like if you could change that would help us bring us closer to a consent culture as opposed to rape culture?
Proper education. I think that like I've interacted with, I did not receive sex ed. I was homeschooled, so I received it from my mom, and it wasn't proper either. But I have friends that went to public schools, and some of the things they learned and did not learn is just crazy to me. It's not scientific. It's not appropriate. It's not like it's actually very shameful. Like a lot of things are made to feel like make people feel very ashamed of their bodies and exploration. And it's just like, to me, I think the most important thing is proper education at a young age, even if it's uncomfortable.
Definitely.
I think it's also like important to see like who needs to be educated. Like people always think like if we let girls know about rape, they won't be victims of sexual assault. But the way that like a lot of organizations approach it is that like if we like educate men who are primarily the perpetrators of sexual assault, then they can help stop each other and stop perpetuating like sexual assault. So I think like having programs that are like led by men because men are dominant in our society, like teaching other men like this behavior is not okay would greatly help to reduce sexual assault. And then also like a lot of our assumptions about sex like should be changed. Like a lot of people think like if there are two women in a relationship, sex can't happen, therefore sexual assault can't happen. Or if there are two men, like sex can't happen, so sexual assault can't happen. And so having conversations and being realistic about who's in relationships with whom and like not making assumptions about people and not being heteronormative would also help to destroy a lot of those barriers.
Definitely.
Yeah, I would say two things: comprehensive sex education. And when I say comprehensive, I mean outside of the heteronormative examples of sex, because children need to know what a sex act is in order to speak up when a sex act has occurred. And if something happens that is outside of the norm of what they expect, or what, I mean, because many children experience sexual assault between the ages of 4 and 6, so they already don't have the language. So as they get older and they do have access to more information and more language, they need to know what sex acts are so that they can report to us when something unsafe has happened. And then they also need consent education, and that needs to start immediately, like as soon as you have a little baby, you can start talking about what consent means, and how and you can incorporate that into lessons in your own home, and additionally in the school environment, really in every environment, right? Like if you're in an institutional environment, whether it's a hospital or a school or a church, all of these environments really need to be pushing forward consent conversations and consent education, even if we can't hope for them to be offering comprehensive sex education, right? They can still be promoting consent and parents not having the fear of having conversations about sex, right? Like empowering our parents or offering them the tools that they need to also have those conversations, so that they're doing a good job and they're not shaming or building up stigma or giving more, creating more problems as far as transphobia, homophobia, all of these things. And the shaming that can sometimes come from religious practices as well. So I think if I ruled the world, those would be things that would be standard. And I think that would be the way that I would work towards ending rape culture.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, again, I echo literally everything that everyone is saying. And the piece that I think all of these have in common as well is this idea of these conversations, right? So Tashmi, you were talking about these conversations, which this is my small ask, right? Is like a value shift towards communication, right? I think like on a grand level, that education is really important, but also I think that it's crucial that communication not be seen as like bad, right? Or like speaking up for what you want or what you don't want. Like having open, honest foundations. And I think that as a culture, right, part of the rape culture piece is that we don't value communication. We value secrecy and sex, which is sexy, right? And these like games instead of like, hey, please touch me here, don't touch me here, right? And so I think that absolutely education is a big piece, and I think that it has a lot to do with this value of like, do we value open, honest communication just in general? And I think that has a lot to do with this positivity, sex negativity thing as well.
Can I real quick add, sorry, was someone going to say something?
Go ahead. Yeah.
That there is a podcast, I want to say it was This American Life, that came out probably last year. and it was called like The Birds and the Bees, and they talked a lot about what how universities are handling the sexual assault conversation. And one of the things that came up was that we don't spend any time talking about what we want to do to one another's bodies, like what the plan is before we actually engage in sex, which I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. But I have a teenage son. So my son is 14, and so we've been having a lot of conversations. But one of the things that we, talked about is like, if you can't even say the body part, right? Like if you can't even say the body part that you want to do the thing to, then maybe it's not time to be doing that thing. maybe we need to dial it back so that you are comfortable expressing to the person who you want that level of intimacy with what you want to do and what you're willing to allow them to do with you. And so when I think about that, like that conversation, it's really about relationship, right? Like it's about how we're in relationship with other people, and that intimacy and that access, and like creating a space where our bodies are not like these pieces, they're not for violence, right? They're not to receive violence, and they're not to enact violence on other people. And so if we can recognize that and draw that boundary, then when we are about to engage in intimacy, then we actually can start building conversation and relationship around those ideals.
Yes, totally. And I think this echoes again, like not like only just preventing sexual assault from happening, but having like good, honest communication will lead to like a better, like healthy, happy experience. And that's like what I think we want for all people, especially like young people, like just getting started and having the tools to communicate, for sure. And so Karen, is there anything you wanted to like add to this question, or if you want to do an introduction? Thank you for being on.
Oh, thank you. I'm not sure. I was here the whole time. I just was not. Nobody could see me. I was like, okay, where am I? I was lost in the abyss. I've kind of been listening, but of course, as I've been listening, I've been trying to get LinkedIn, so I haven't heard a good deal of the conversation. If you want to know about me, I'm an attorney, and I represent kids, young women primarily, that have been sexually assaulted in their schools. And as a result, the school or their university or college have not treated them properly or reacted properly. And typically have not complied with Title IX and the requirements of Title IX. And it's a term of art when we say that the school or the university has acted with what we call deliberate indifference, meaning they just didn't do what they were supposed to do. So that's basically my sole practice is now just representing kids that have been sexually assaulted, both at the secondary level and the university and college level.
Okay, thank you. That work is really important and needed. Unfortunately, I wish schools would just treat people properly, but they don't.
That is true.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So
it kind of just comes down to common sense.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is. A lot of it is common sense. And even though I've been doing this a while now, I'm still shocked. Well, not shocked. I'm still just kind of surprised, I guess, when I run into college and secondary. And now I'm even getting kids that are younger in elementary school, that the administrators and the principals and the superintendents just don't get it. Even when they have kids of their own and they still don't get it. It's baffling. It's very baffling to me. And now it's just Mika, my dog, is barking.
Yeah.
One of them.
Solidarity.
I think that really ties into our next question. And again, just a reminder to our attendees to feel free to ask questions at any time. We'll plug them in. But in your experience, how have institutions like schools, religion, laws, et cetera, have impacted like your views on sexual assault and consent?
Is that directed to me? Or
anybody who wants to answer, or go first.
How has it affected my views? How they've responded, or?
Yeah, just like from.
Well, I don't want to become dismayed. but I have in a way, because I like I said, I am very puzzled and baffled by the lack of understanding of how how college administrators and secondary school administrators are supposed to, under the law, take care of their students. And they, number one, they don't know what they're supposed to do. And number two, if they do know, they still don't do it. So I'm a parent. My daughter's 13 years old. 5 years ago, if you had asked me if this stuff goes on, I would have said, "Oh no, it does it." I mean, I knew it happened, but I had no idea to the extent that it takes place, and I think that's probably been my biggest surprise. I have enough work to keep me busy for the next 10 years, and that, I mean, and that's, you know, and I get calls every single day, and kids are getting younger, so I think that's been my biggest surprise.
I think like the biggest thing I've noticed is just like, especially with religious institutions, there's not a lot of addressing about sexual assault. Like, pastors talk all day about like homophobia, especially like in my church, but they don't want to address like issues and things that are actually really important to like keeping a lot of their congregations safe, because like most religious people are women, which I think is important to point out. It's pretty ironic to me that like there are these issues that largely affect like a lot of women of color, and their religious leaders are not in tune with that and they're not talking about it. It's never addressed. Like, I was actually sexually assaulted by a member of my community at church, and I already knew, like, I was like, there's no point in mentioning this to anyone because they're not going to believe me. And it's disheartening. It's like watching a lot of the people in charge just not really care is, it's a good word for that. I would say that it is making me very upset, and I view sexual assault as maybe not something that religious organizations are willing to handle, and therefore, why even bother with like trying to get them involved if they're not going to listen? It doesn't matter. With laws, there was just like a law that came out in either North or South Carolina, basically saying that once sex was initiated, like it's going to happen until the end, and like how we define the end and beginning of sex is already like very gray. So trying to say that like once you give consent, it can't be revoked, which is like, it's ridiculous just from like a contract perspective, because like in many contracts you can revoke them at many different times if like certain things start to happen, and you find out things are not the way. If other people aren't complying, then they're part of the contract. The contract is null. So maybe to me, it's like I'm not always convinced that this is something that lawmakers should and like voters need to be involved in. Instead, there needs to be like specific groups of people who get to make those decisions, who have knowledge and can educate the community properly.
Totally.
Yeah, I definitely echo what Michaela was saying, especially about the religious organizations. As I said, I was born into a very religious home, and grew up in the IFB, which is an Independent Fundamental Baptist. And a lot of people hear Baptist and they think Baptist, the IFB, is not regular Baptist. It's kind of like, the only way I know how to describe it is it's like what the Duggars are from like that TLC show with the 1,000 Children. Like that's essentially the type of place I was raised in. And like I said earlier, we weren't taught consent because we were taught abstinence until marriage. And then once you are married, we were taught that you are supposed to submit to your husband in all ways, and that includes sex. And there's no such thing as spousal rape in such a conservative Christian home. And so, like, I grew up hearing that, and it was terrifying. Like, that's a scary thought to think that, like, once I put that ring on my finger, my body is no longer mine. I don't have control over it, and it's not mine anymore. And I think that it's true. There are so many. I remember there was a religious person at our church who came up to my mom and when I was like 13 or 14 and said he felt like the clothes I was wearing to church were inappropriate. Well, for one, he was like a 40-year-old man and I was a child. Like, don't you think that you might be the problem at that point? Not the 13-year-old girl who was wearing long dresses and baggy tops because my mom was super conservative. And I went to a Christian college and it was the same thing. Like I knew a girl that was raped by her boyfriend on campus, and she went to the campus authorities and they expelled him, but they also expelled her for having sex. Even though it was not consensual, she was no longer chaste. So like stuff like that, like he should have been kicked out, but like she did not give consent. But because she was in a place, she was alone with him, they told her, well, you shouldn't have been alone with him. And that's just kind of how I was raised. Like, if you don't want this to happen, you shouldn't be alone with a man. Like, I was told repeatedly as a child growing up, I was told, like, never to let a man touch me. Like, I was told no kissing, no holding hands, because once you do that, a man can't stop. So, like, dating has always been terrifying because, like, you go back to that and you think that, like, men can't stop. Like, once something is initiated, you can't expect him to stop because that's unfair to him. That's not right. That's defrauding him. And it's just like, and I know that I'm not the only person that was taught that. Like, I know there are people all over the nation, all over the world that are taught like that. And it's absolutely terrifying to know that that's something that's still being instilled in young men and young women, and nobody's taking responsibility for it, especially the church.
Definitely. Any others want to add? Yeah, Tashmika.
So I was just going to say, the institutions are just large groups of people doing shit wrong. Like it doesn't even, it's, you know, the older I've gotten, the more institutions I've been involved with, the more it's like I don't want to be jaded, right? Because there are people within those institutions and that are attempting to do things, to take responsibility and be accountable for the way that they treat people in their community. There are great churches that are actually functioning in a way that doesn't uphold patriarchy and like giving away a woman's body to her husband. There are institutions within schools that are maybe people within institutions that are schools that are maybe doing a better job. However, it's rolling the dice. Like you roll the dice when you go into a church and in the church that you belong to, that you tithe and you volunteer and you tell the wrong person that it's like a toss up, you know. And then some churches, it's obvious that they, you know, IFB, there are a lot of churches that are still promoting those dangerous messages. It's true, but there are people who are not in the church that have nothing to do with religion, that promote those very same ideas out in our communities, that are not accountable for the way that they treat people or harm people, and they don't go to jail. So it's like, I try to, like, my church experience is very similar. I grew up in the Bible Belt. And my experience with a lot of institutions has seen a lot of harm. But the one thing that I will note is that when I walk outside my door every day, I see all that same harm, because across the board, we find ways, and by we, I should say, right, the patriarchy, like finds ways to make sure that they are invested in maintaining power over our bodies and over the way that we're allowed to have autonomy. And so that may have been rooted in some institution down the road because this is the culture we live in. And so when I look at institutions, I'm looking at people and changing culture, because it's not, the institutions are the culture and the culture is the institution. And so we have to be willing to do the work of the culture shift in order to see those changes happening.
Definitely. I think that just reminds me of the metaphor, like you can't walk in the rain without getting wet. And so even though as much as like we're really like trying to change these, if like our overall culture spews these horrible ideals, like you're still soaking it in. So it's just like really important to make these shifts at a larger level. Definitely. Any other panelists want to share on this question of institutions? Cool. So we're actually going to do a quick poll for attendees and panelists. Basically, Brittany's going to pull up the poll, and just to get some quick feedback on like what your thoughts on like institution are. And while we pull that up, we do have a question from the audience for Karen. So Karen, we know there are many situations where consent may be given at a time of sexual activity, but that one of the partners later creates a hostile environment at school. Talk a little bit about the limitations of consent education. It seems so many schools believe that consent education is a solution and that the schools have no further responsibility if the student initially consented.
Okay, if I understand that question correctly, and it's from Stop Sexual Assault in Schools, which is an advocacy group that I serve on the board of that group. And they are an advocacy group that educates about sexual assault in secondary schools, because most people think it only happens in colleges and universities, and it doesn't. And that's where Stop Sexual Assault in Schools comes in. Yeah, a lot of people think that we just got to teach them what's right and what's wrong, what's an appropriate touching, what's not appropriate touching, what's an affirmative yes, what's an affirmative no, and then their job is over. And that is not, in my work, my job, I get the kids after they've been assaulted, after that damage has been done, but the majority of the damage comes from how the schools treat them afterwards. And, the person, the institution or the teacher, the nun, whoever it is, the priest who's supposed to take care of that kid, the one they look to for support is the one that shoots them down. And so when you talk about consent education, it does not stop there. The responsibility really comes after the section. I mean, there's a prevention and then there's taking care of them afterwards. And I think they forget about that second responsibility. And giving kids instruction about consent is important, but we need to teach our school administrators about how to take care of these kids afterwards if the consent education didn't work. I think that's what that person was asking me. It is limited. And, there's different schools of thought about it. Do they need to say no, or does there need to be an affirmative yes? Taryn and I just talked about that the other day, what the difference between that. But, when it all comes down to, if it's something that somebody didn't want, they didn't want it, and the other person has to stop. And whether they said yes or no, if they have that indication, I don't want this, then consent has been taken away. But schools definitely don't get that. They don't get that.
Yeah, and do any other panelists want to add on to that? Okay.
I think there's also like for colleges and universities, especially like a lot of the university, at least at my university, they don't do any of the sexual assault education. All the sexual assault education is done by like volunteers who are unpaid, underappreciated, and like have little direction. And the people in charge really have no idea like what these people are saying when they go to their sessions that they're presenting at. And so they just have to like hope and pray that these people are not saying awful things. And recently there was an incident where our Title IX coordinator was just saying some really shady things, but we're all required to report any sexual assaults that we know about to her if they happened on or around campus or with a student. We're required to, even if we don't think she's the best person for us to be talking to, or for survivors to be talking to about that. And so at least at the college level, like the fact that there's like consent education is definitely not enough, because we need to think about like who are we hiring as our Title IX coordinator. I know that for like Title IX coordinators in school, like they could be anybody, like literally like a lot of different people who are not qualified to do that job could become the Title IX coordinator. And that's just not fair, like to students who are experiencing sexual assault and sexual violence on campus, that like somebody who's woefully unprepared to help them deal with their issues is now assigned with that task. And like, so consent education is definitely not enough, because in colleges, it's like, it's done by people who probably were like trained okay, but they could have missed sessions, they could have missed really important sessions, and are now still certified to be doing consent education. And while there are like screening processes, those don't always work. We found out that this like really creepy man was a sexual assault educator, and we found out like way too late, after like for several months he was an educator for our community. So that's definitely not enough. They need to like do some more vetting. And
yeah. And I think that's like, again, a lot of this is not happening in elementary, middle school, or high schools. And when it's happening at college, it's from like programs that like don't have funding to pay people, do the proper vetting. So yeah, it's definitely a problem. And then thanks everybody for participating in the poll. So I think it was interesting to see where people, you know, thought like that which institutions, and it was like friends and family were like the top ones for that. So it's definitely interesting to see. And so I do want to do a quick time check. We have like about 11 minutes left. So if you have other questions, please make sure to submit them through the Q&A. But I am going to move on to the next one. And I think this is just like really important, especially with everything that's going on in the world right now, is how do we see sexual assault and consent issues affect people with different identities, like LGBTQ plus folks, people of color, people with disabilities. I mean, the list could go on and on. And then if you want to add, I know this is a lot, but how that could shift, how we could kind of like change those disparities for the effects on different identities.
So I've actually been thinking a lot, well, because of the life we're living right now and the world we're living in, I think we're probably all thinking about this a lot. But for me, there's no separating sexual assault from racism or poverty or transphobia or, you know, or disability justice. There is no attempting to end sexual assault if we're not addressing those issues, because our Native peoples are still more impacted by sexual assault and have far less resources than those of us who are white. And that, you know, and we can go down all the statistics. There are people who have disabilities who do not have access to the resources, but also don't have the same protective factors or capabilities than many of us do. And so for me, when I'm thinking about like how, you know, what can we do to change it? Well, we have to center the people at the margins, which is kind of like, I feel like that's kind of like a buzz phrase now. Like everyone's like, we have to center people in intersectionality. But really we do, like when we're thinking about, when we're doing this work, we need to be thinking about the people who are the most harmed and have the least amount of access to resources. And those are the people that we need to serve, because by serving them, we will serve all of the other people who have privileges above them. And so for me, that's what I'm thinking about when I'm doing my own work. That's where I'm going. I'm going to that center and trying to work from that space to the best of my ability. And to be clear, that means that I'm not doing that, right? Like I'm calling in those people and I'm saying, you show me where those problems are. And I'm not like gonna go and say, I'm not coming in as a savior. I am basically a conduit, right? Like I may have more funding than they have, or I may have more access to resources, but I can make my focus centering those people. And so I think organizations, institutions, we need to be focusing on that. And we also need to be funding programs that center those people instead of funding programs that center white middle-class people, because all of those people at the margins aren't getting served with that funding. That's all I'm done.
Yes, totally agree 100% on that.
I love everything you just said, Tajmika. I think also making sure that like there are people who represent these groups in leadership roles. If you don't have like, it's great that like white women care about people of color and that able-bodied people care about disabled people, but me as an able-bodied person doesn't really know the experience of a person with a disability. I need them to tell me what their experience is like, and I need a lot of people who are not like me to tell me what their experience is like, so we're not engaging in tokenism. So making sure that like we have leadership that reflects the population that we're trying to serve is absolutely vital.
I'm sorry. And also, if you don't already have those relationships with those people that you want to help, then maybe you're not the person to be helping them. So that's also a thing that I think a lot about, is that if you don't already have those relationships, then you don't know, like, what are you doing? Why are you in that space? Those people that can lead their own, and we need to be supporting them with the funding and our volunteer time and our listening ears to actually learn how to support them.
100%. Others want to touch on this?
I mean, I think that obviously for me, I'm like a white woman, so I have different privileges. And I think the biggest thing like for other white people is to shut up and listen. Like truly. Like I can't understand what like a disabled person or a person of color goes through because of that. I can't even begin to understand. And so like trying to act like I can, or like I think a lot of people don't understand that you have to like come in and like sometimes just be silent and listen, because we don't know those struggles. And like I think so many people start getting defensive when they hear the word privilege, and you're part of the problem at that point. Because like you are, like, as a white person, I understand that I am privileged. I come from a life of privilege, and like that's not necessarily a negative thing. It's just something that I was born into, and like people need to stop getting defensive about that term and sit back and listen to the real problems.
Definitely. Thanks for sharing that. Anybody else have anything they want to add to this question?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ellie.
I feel like I keep saying like yes to everything, but also yes to everything that everyone has been saying. And I absolutely agree with the basic premise that you can't separate sexual assault and consent issues from all of these isms. And I had a really smart thought about why that was, and now it's gone. Oh, and because it all has to come back to power and control, right? And so if we see sexual assault as a way to exert power, you can't separate that from racism. You can't separate that from homophobia or transphobia or ableism, because it's all about exerting power, again, over these like disenfranchised groups. And so I echo and agree with all of that can be done to help change these disparities, and wanted to kind of throw out this power and control piece as why you can't separate these things out.
Yes, definitely. Any other thoughts or comments on this one, disparities and identities? Okay. Thank you. I loved all the insight on that. I think that's like super important, and especially just, yeah, I mean, like Tajmika said, like just the world we're living in right now, like you can't not think about that. So yeah, that's just super important. So unfortunately we only have 3 minutes left. This hour went by so fast, and we do really want to be respectful of people's times, because I know it's like 5 o'clock is the end of the day. So I do just want to give our panelists, like, one, thank you so much for sharing your insight, and two, with like the few minutes we have left, if there's like there was so much we didn't get to talk about today. Obviously, like we could spend hours on this, but we do have a couple like wrap up polls on like how people are feeling and whatnot. But while those are going on, if there's a topic or idea that you wanted to share but you didn't get a chance to, then we can maybe like go down the line and share that as we like wrap up in the last couple minutes. Any final thoughts or whatnot?
I can't tell. Is anyone talking?
No one is talking, so you can go ahead.
No one is talking?
Yes.
All these people? I'll wrap it. I thank all of you for all the work you're doing. What I do is kind of new, so people don't even really know that we have lawyers that do this stuff. So, because there aren't there many of us out there. But yeah, there's a lot going on, especially with our esteemed Secretary of Education, who I will not mention her name, that has cast a new light a little bit on sexual assault and how it's addressed in school. So I'm not as doom and gloom as a lot of people are about the changes that she's trying to implement. I think things will change, but I don't think it's going to be as bad as people think it is. But we definitely have to be cognizant of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for touching on that. I know it's like been a big issue lately.
Yes, and a lot of people don't understand, Title IX and what all of that means, and that's probably a topic for another panel, I think.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I would like to thank everybody for their work too. It's incredible. And we all it's really easy to get mired down by all the garbage because there's so much of it. But I know that you can probably at least think of one victory, that you've had recently, because this work is in inches. It's like, I have a friend who's like, some people have like a 3 to 5 year strategic plan. People in this movement need a 3,000 year plan. Because that's what it feels like sometimes. So I just really appreciate all of your perspectives and everything that you do. And Stephanie, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this today. I really appreciate you.
Thanks. Thank you so much for being on. And we do have our poll results. But of course, as people read these over, feel free if anybody else wants to add to it, to their like final thoughts.
Well, I'm glad nobody's feeling confused.
Yeah.
That's a good sign.
Yeah. I'm glad at least 50% of the people are feeling informed and inspired. And I think too, like with feeling like sad and angry, I think those are obviously like totally valid feelings to be feeling right now, because it is like an overwhelming topic. And Tajamika, I appreciate like the 3,000 year strategic plan. It can feel like really overwhelming, but I think it's like everybody coming to this and like hearing like amazing like words and insight is like really important. So
and the important part about that plan is we are not the ones to do it by ourselves. That's why it's 3,000 years, because we need I will be long dead and gone before it's
Yeah. Any other final thoughts from our panelists? Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being on. This is live on Facebook, so we will have the video on our Facebook page and whatnot. You can like Moash, MOASH, on Facebook to kind of like keep up to date. If you want to share this video, because there's like so many great words shared, please do. And yeah, definitely like email us to get involved. Hopefully we can continue conversations like this in the future. So thank you so much, everybody. Hope you enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.
Thank you. Bye.